Thanks for having me here this afternoon. This paper is going to think about the role of surprise or irregularity in how T.S. Eliot is defending and thinking about the permanent things in his poetry. And I'm going to begin this afternoon by asking you to join me in conducting an experiment. Don't worry, early on in my academic career, I exchanged biochemistry for history and then literature. So this investigation will be of the thought experiment variety. Imagine we have all been formally trained in literature, specifically in poetry. We have all stood in awe of that Homeric epic about Achilles' rage, read Dante's breathtaking Terza Rima in the original Italian, and wrestled with how Milton's blank verse frames the figure of the Son of God. Since in this scenario, we all agree on the significance of formal verse, its potential, and its importance, we can now enter the second sphere of our experiment, free verse. We, in this experiment, together believe that free verse, or verse without a consistent metrical pattern, is not free at all, but is rather an intentional break from form to vivify language and the tradition of poetry. We believe that some poets in the last 100 years broke away from formal verse with knowledge of the tradition deep in their bones, that they had been rigorously trained in formal verse, and they expect the same knowledge from their readers. Thus, free verse rests upon the tradition and is in dialogue with it. Free verse is like Jacob wrestling with the angel, not letting go of form until it receives a blessing. So now that we've set the parameters for this procedure, we can explore what seemingly non-traditional forms mean for our relationship to tradition, and what exactly we might learn from surprising forms in poetry. I've invited you into this experiment because T.S. Eliot was such a figure. I've even stolen his language of experimentation, tradition in the bones, and vivifying language through new forms to set the stage. Eliot was a poet steeped in tradition, who also broke the rules of poetry. Russell Kirk and Roger Scruton called him the great conservative poet of their time, and yet he dramatically changed the face of poetry. I think maybe too often we breeze by the irregularity of Eliot's verse, citing his love for tradition or the fact that he hated poetry that was a diarrhea of emotions. These things are true, and yet his verse remains strange, surprising, and free in some of the ways described above, and yet not antagonistic to tradition. In light of Eliot's formal innovations in verse, his surprising poetry, today I want to make just 3 points about what Eliot's irregular form communicates about tradition and to our relationship to the permanent things. But first, a brief note on Kirk and Scruton's love for Eliot. In 1971, Kirk published a lengthy work dedicated to the poet called Eliot and His Age, T.S. Eliot's Moral Imagination in the 20th Century. And in 2003, Scruton published an article titled T.S. Eliot as Conservative Mentor. Scruton names Eliot his favorite author, and Kirk calls Eliot a voice for orthodoxy in the 20th century, describing, quote, although his voice might startle the ears of his audiences, they listened. In their respective writing, Scruton and Kirk detail why Eliot is a figure worth admitting to the canon of conservatism. But it is this act that Kirk describes of startling readers that I'd like to dwell upon today. Just 3 years after Eliot penned his famous essay on tradition in 1919, he published The Wasteland, that ineffable elegy of the modern age that changed the face of poetry. Scruton himself recognizes that Eliot was a modernist par excellence, calling him, quote, the man who overthrew the 19th century in literature and inaugurated the age of free verse, alienation, and experiment. If you've read The Wasteland at all or recently, you remain confused by The Wasteland. Its fragmented stanzas forcing you both to recognize connections and submit to the fact that the poem is actively resisting your simple solutions, as well as any one kind of unifying form. There's a narrative that separates the pre- and post-Christian Eliot, assigning these wasteland fragments shored against ruin to Eliot's agnostic days. But while the poetry and form does indeed change across Eliot's career, formal irregularity remains. Eliot joined the Church of England and became a British citizen in 1927. He then wrote a series of poems, which have come to be known as the Ariel poems. Scruton writes, "This phase of his development culminated in a profound Christian statement, the poem Ash Wednesday. Eliot was ready to take up his own peculiar cross, the cross of membership," Scruton writes. But once again, if you have read Ash Wednesday at all or recently, this profound Christian statement is both beautiful and baffling and shot through with modernist form. While Eliot's poetic form is by no means static across his career, there's a kind of continuity of some unorthodox forms for orthodoxy that runs across his poetry, and it is this thread upon which this paper reflects. What Scruton calls the paradox of T.S. Eliot, that our greatest literary modernist should also be our greatest modern conservative. Scruton avers that Eliot's philosophy never matched the height of his poetry, so this paper focuses largely on the poetry and what there is to learn from Eliot's paradox of modernism and conservatism. So my first point is fairly obvious, but I don't think it goes without saying. Eliot's surprising form illustrates that working within a tradition does not necessarily mean doing things the same way they have always been done. Marina, one of the early poems Eliot writes after he joins the Church of England, is a gorgeous lyric that's couched in references to Heracles' myth and Shakespeare's Pericles. With images from the tradition, but free verse, it gives voice to the terror and joy that come hand in hand with revelation. Dennis Donahue writes, "My sense of the poem is that its content, its story, is Eliot's conversion to Christianity, his waking up to find himself a Christian and wondering what to make of it all." Go read the poem. It's breathtaking. But I'd like to draw attention to the way in which the first readers of the poem would have experienced it, within a pamphlet designed like a Christmas card with works of art commissioned by his publishing company, Faber, on the front and inside page. Both works of art are definitively abstract. The first clearly draws upon Cubist aesthetics, melding what looks to be a deconstructed building with a rock face and a one-eyed profile. Eliot wrote poems for Faber's Ariel Poems collection for years, and he was particularly pleased that the artist, E. McKnight Coffer, was given the task of creating a work of art for his very beloved poem. Eliot had all the illustrations hung in his flat. The image highlights how the Christian Eliot partnered with decidedly new art forms to capture one of the oldest stories of the Christian tradition, the story of turning, of conversion. I really was genuinely surprised when I first saw the illustration, and I've tracked down a copy in a used bookstore in Oxford, and it just sits on my desk in my office, and I remain baffled, and so do my students. Because the image unravels the neat modernist versus Christian narrative that I'd come to know about Eliot, and reinforces instead the paradox that Scruton observes. Eliot's modernist aesthetics go beyond narrating deconstruction. They become a tool for his constructive work. And this is nowhere better seen than in Ash Wednesday, published in 1930, the same year as Marina. The title itself marks a concrete starting point by referencing a significant day in the liturgical year, a day where Christians around the world remember they are dust and learn, again, to relinquish those dusty desires that hold them fast. Ash Wednesday is a day that evokes a standard fare of imaginative associations. But Eliot's poem is anything but standard. I really will never forget my students' surprise as they encountered Eliot's Christian verse, as the poetry washed over them with the same kind of awe and dizzying confusion as a wade into a waterless wasteland. But this time, with some familiar footholds for those who worship in liturgical traditions. The first section of Ash Wednesday is a cascading series of enjambed lines, making readers long for a comma, as they advance through disorienting sentences that run into each other and disassemble language itself. Eliot does not engage with traditional form to take on this traditional liturgical day. To embody emptying, he takes up something like the fragments of the wasteland or the disjunction of Coffer's artwork. And these particular fragments tend toward hope, that the speaker is relinquishing his own pride in language to give over his voice to the words Christians have been praying for centuries. Pray for us now and at the hour of our death. Eliot uses his modernist tools to model what it might mean to join this membership, as Scruton describes. And in Ash Wednesday, he does it to stunning effect. I am reminded of Eliot's words in Tradition and the Individual Talent. Yet, if the only form of tradition, of handing down, consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to is success, tradition should be positively discouraged. This brings me to my second point. Eliot's surprising form communicates that the permanent things are neither finite nor controllable. James Loggenbach narrates the phase of scholarship that gave the wasteland a scaffold, so to speak, by interpreting the whole poem through the lens of the Grail myth. And yes, this Arthurian fragment, shored against ruin, is significant for the poem. But myths, for Eliot's verse, are ordering structures, not answers. Loggenbach writes, "The proposed presence of a key turned the whole poem into a lock." I'm arrested by this image from Loggenbach because it communicates how Eliot's form resists ownership by interpreters, as do the permanent things. But the poem's resistance, its difficulty, as Michael Hurley writes, does not necessarily mean it denies interpretation. Rather, it signals that to interpret the poem rightly, we must submit to the fact that it will endlessly exceed us. This is true of the wasteland, and it is true of the quartets. In fact, the quartets, formally and topically, habituate readers to the kind of humility reading Eliot's poetry demands. East Coker warns, "The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless." You don't have to break form to write irreducible poetry. But Eliot does. Eliot simply models what poetry at its best accomplishes. It acts as an approach to mystery, crushing our delusions about fully understanding those things that by their nature refuse to be locks to our human-made keys. The life of keys and locks leads to the kind of technological disasters we find ourselves in. Benjamin Parvis recently diagnosed the dark world of medically assisted suicide as a failure to embrace the mystery of death and dying. He writes that we turn mysteries into problems, and we imagine we have solutions to circumstances that cannot, by human effort, be solved, such as the difficulty of dying well or of being with a loved one in their death. We have reduced mystery to a murderous degree. Eliot's poetry not only reminds us to stop reducing, but formally disallows us from reducing. It acts as a formidable reminder of the depths of enduring truths that we will lose by solving, inviting us to endlessly explore them instead. Again, Michael Hurley writes, "As a reader of Eliot, a refusal to risk failing is nothing less than a refusal to read him. Eliot's form is a school in humility and failure, not failure of permanent truths, but of us, who can only preserve these things if we recognize their otherness from us." My third and final point, Eliot's surprising form illustrates why we need art in our lives, to pull us outside of ourselves and toward these permanent things. Etymologically, the earliest use of surprise is of attacking without warning. And later, the word assumes the more recognizable valences of surprise parties. It's a word defined by movement, to overtake, seize, invade, or to grasp or seize. I think that Eliot's form displays this aspect of surprise. His poetry breaks in with a kind of force that acts upon the reader before they can get their bearings, let alone analyze. As Eliot says, after all, genuine poetry can communicate before it is understood. What else captures the experience of letting the language of the four quartets wash over you, loving it deeply, but not having any words to explain why, just lines you love in your bewilderment? I often conceive of my role as a professor of literature as providing students with the tools to read poetry such that poetry can then seize them, invade their lives, so that it can capture them. It's a frightening prospect, but one that might allow students to behold and learn to love mysteries inaccessible to the person defined by locks and keys. Eliot writes, "So in poetry you can, now and then, penetrate into another country, so to speak, before your passport has even been issued or your ticket taken." If we need to live in light of mysteries we cannot capture or fully put into words, we need then to be captured by poetry. In conclusion, this is not an argument against traditional form. Remember our opening experiment. Rather, it is an argument founded upon the premise of traditional form. It is not an argument for endless novelty, but perhaps it is a kind of defense of free verse. Eliot writes, "In a particular sense, the poet will be aware that he must inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. I say judged, not amputated by them. I sometimes wonder if we are amputating forms of art that might help us, if we are taking seriously the fact that Kirk and Scruton loved this modernist poet. I wonder if we met Eliot today, would we?" Eliot's verse reminds us that we are not prison keepers or museum curators of the permanent things. We are stewards, gardeners, teachers, pilgrims, all roles that require care, awe, and a freedom that allows for surprise. In the words of A.G. Sertalange, let us not be like those people who always seem to be pallbearers at the funeral of the past. Thank you.